Hello everyone, you're watching Altek2k Gaming. In this one I'm going to walk you through my process for designing a build around an item. In this case it's going to be Oni-goroshi, which is farmable from the Twilight Strand. Now this isn't the only way to design a build. I also build around skill gems, ascendancies and sometimes just concepts. So how do I go about designing a build around an item? Oni-goroshi is going to be a pretty good example of how I do this because it's got some really strong mechanics. Okay, so let's get into it. The first thing I want to do is identify the item's strengths, weaknesses, any triggers we need to make it good, and what it scales from. Okay, so what are its strengths? The first one is it's got a really high base crit value. It's between 8.5 and 9.5% based upon how good the weapon is. And the only thing that actually changes on this weapon is the amount of crit chance it gets. Another strength is it gains as we level, so leveling shouldn't feel bad. It should be pretty good as a leveling sword. Now it also effectively gives us Onslaught without giving us the Onslaught buff, allowing us to get Onslaught again once we have her Embrace, and we'll talk about her Embrace in a little while. Also while in her Embrace we get immunity to Freeze, Shock, Ignite and Burning Ground. We also get 123% of sword damage as extra fire damage, and it's a 6 link. So the main weakness of this skill is a big one. It gives us a degen as fire based upon the total amount of life we've got, and at level 100 it's a 50% of our life, so at 6,000 life, we will be dealt 3,000 fire damage per second while her Embrace lasts. And her Embrace lasts for 3 seconds, and actually we want it up all the time. So our build does need to be able to cope with 3k fire damage per second, which isn't an easy task. Now the other thing is, whilst it has 6 sockets and takes up both of our weapon slots, it's not a two-handed weapon. It's still a one-handed weapon, and we can only use one of them. And one-handed weapons could do nowhere near as much damage as two-handed weapons, although the buff of her Embrace sort of levels that off. Now the other thing is, because of the way her Embrace works, this won't work very well for spells, and that's because it gives us the extra fire damage but only to attacks, because it's based on the sword's damage, and it's very specific about that in the buff description. Okay, so what do we mean by triggers? This sword requires her Embrace to feel good, and triggering her Embrace is what we're talking about here. So to proc her Embrace, we need to ignite an enemy, and then her Embrace will activate for 3 seconds. So within 3 seconds, to keep that up, we must ignite one enemy per 3 seconds. So how can we do that? The easiest way to ignite is to do a critical hit of fire damage. That will ignite the enemy. And given the sword has an 8.5 or 9.5% base crit chance, that's probably going to be fairly easy. Now at just shy of 10%, that's going to be 1 in 10 hits. Now in order to proc this consistently while leveling, we need to be able to at least do a fire hit, it needs to be critical, and we need to attack fairly quickly so that low crit chance will actually proc it. So early on we're probably going to want some help getting some crit, get some attack speed on it, and it'll probably feel relatively good. Now the sword itself gives us a sort of Onslaught, and we can use the Onslaught gem to help speed up our attack speed. From Act 2 we can also get Blood Rage, which will help increase our attack speed as well and give us frenzy charges. Okay, so what does the sword scale off? It's a one-handed sword, so one-handed weapon or sword is the way to go. Because of its high crit we want either crit or crit multi, probably a good balance of both. It will also scale off physical damage because that's what the sword basically does, and then it gives you extra fire damage, so we want physical, fire, fire dot and dot multi. So firstly we need to work out how we're going to deal with the degen, because that's going to be our biggest problem of building around this, because the degen is going to be pretty big. So to solve for this degen we're going to have to make a couple of assumptions. One is the level we're going to be. Let's say we're going to cap out around 95. So that's 47.5% of our life dealt as fire damage. We're also going to assume we have no energy shield, or not enough that it makes any real difference. So at 6,054 life, which is what my build currently has, we're taking somewhere in the order of 2,845.38 damage unmitigated from fire per second. That's quite a lot. Now her Embrace lasts for 3 seconds, so we'll be taking that damage for 3 seconds, giving us a total damage of 8,536 damage, which is massive. It's more than our whole life pool in 3 seconds. So unless we have a way of mitigating that, we're going to die. But we've also got to assume we have 75% elemental resistances, which will knock that damage down to around 2,134 damage, which is much less than our total life, so it's not going to kill us anymore. Now I also know starting in the Marauder area or the Duelist area, which is where I did start with this build, we're going to have within range +2 to fire resist, so we can take that up to 77% if we wish. And that would reduce the damage by another 170 over those 3 seconds. So the total damage we'd be taking is 1,963. Now that's still an awful lot. And as we want to keep this up all the time, there's no way we're going to get 50% of regen to be able to do that. So regen on its own will not cut it. Also, Fortify won't cut it because Fortify only works on hits and this damage doesn't say it hits. Wise Oak will give us a 10% reduction to that damage, which would be quite nice, and Arctic Armour could also give us an 8% less to fire damage, which would also help. But using Arctic Armour is probably going to drop my damage, which is not really what I want. So we're either going to have to go for Life Leech and Regen, or we could go Life Leech with Valpact. We can leech about 1.5k with all the passives in our radius. So we are going to have either extra Regen to get us that extra 500, or we go Valpact and take that 1.5k to over 3k. Now we really want to work out where we're going to ascend from, and there are several good options. There's a Chieftain which scales around fire damage, there's a Berserker that gives us lots and lots of attack damage, or there's the Slayer. Now the Slayer's a pretty good one because it gives us super cool. It also gives us some leech enhancements, so for this I did go Slayer. But both of those other options would be very, very good, with Chieftain being probably the best of the two. Now what Keystones do we want to do our build off? This is always the next thing I look at after Ascendancies, and we know Valpact straight away because we said we want to offset that degen. So what are the Keystones would really work with this? Resolute Technique is out, because if we can't crit, we can't get her Embrace, which makes this sword rubbish. But we don't need anything for anti-stun, so nothing in that regard. Avatar of Fire is going to be a good one for us, because it will convert all our Fizz to fire, and any other elemental damage we get to fire, which means scaling fire will then boost that even further. So Avatar of Fire is probably the way we want to go. Now because we're starting in the Duelist area and probably pathing up through Marauder to get the extra life, we're not going to be able to get things like Acrobatics and Phase Acro to give us that extra layer of defense. So what's available to us in our area? There's a couple of armor nodes which will be quite useful. There's also some blind nodes that synergize with crit, which also means the small amount of evasion we have on this character will double up, because that's what blind does. So then I go and plan out the tree, and it looks something like this. Now we also need to pick a skill. We know it needs to be an attack, because this won't work very well with spells. Now we also probably want a skill that attacks really fast, and that's because it's giving us basically Onslaught without Onslaught. We can get Onslaught on top of that, and then as we're going Slayer, we also get extra attack speed from Slayer, which means we can get a really large amount. And I'm probably going to pick Lacerate. I haven't played Lacerate since they changed Lacerate, because I hated the speed at which it went. So the other two skills I'd probably consider going with here are Blade Storm and Cyclone. Blade Storm I'm not going to do because my other character in this league was a Blade Storm. I've also got another idea for a Cyclone, so Lacerate it is. So with our tree and with some example gear, we get up to 2.4 million DPS. And if we switch that to Cyrus Boss Mode, we'll get about 1.9 million DPS, which is a good amount, given the nerfs for this league. And that assumes, of course, that we hit with both of the Lacerate overlaps, which we will for bosses for certain. So the way Lacerate works is it fires out 2 cones in front of you, they can overlap in the middle. Anything you hit in the middle takes double damage effectively. We then start looking at other items that synergize, and one of those is Zoph's Blood. Zoph's Blood is a fairly inexpensive amulet in this league. I think it was something like 60 chaos. And that gives us increased strength, increased life, fire resist, damage penetrates 10% of fire resistance, cover enemies in ash when you hit them, and it gives us the Keystone of Avatar of Fire, so we don't need it on the tree. So Zoph's Blood was then our second choice. Now I would like to remind everyone that the like button loves to be tickled. Please tickle it. It'll like it a lot. I also heard a rumour that the subscribe button sometimes likes a little tickle, although I don't know that for certain. Now, what about flasks? I said Wise Oak was probably really important here. Because it's a melee skill, we probably also want something like Lionized Roar. But they're the only uniques I think we're going to need for this build, so everything else is just going to be rare, unless I find a great unique that I didn't anticipate. Obviously in the belt slot I would love to put in a Headhunter, but that realistically isn't going to happen for me this league. Unless of course I'm extraordinarily lucky, which let's face it doesn't happen. But once you get more comfortable with path of building and roughly where you go for certain kinds of build, you don't always need to fully design your build in PoB before you get going. And sometimes I just want to get going. You know, you finish work, you don't want to come home and plan a build before you start one. What I do tend to do sometimes, if it's not mechanically taxing, I'll pick my Keystones path towards them and then work out what I get along the way, and that normally works for me. It won't always lead to the best build, and sometimes you'll have to do some re-rolling later to refine it, but it gets you going fast if you don't like planning excessively in PoE. And with that, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.